right, good morning, explorers, and welcome back to another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Ty, and I'm coming here from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. I'm also joined by my friend Tiffany, who's behind the camera, who will be working all the magic that you see behind me. Now, for today's exploration, we would love to have you join us live and hear your amazing observations, or if you have any questions along our journey, we love to hear them. So you can use this number right below at 562-286-1838, and then Tiffany will be able to pass along any of your questions or observations. Or if you're watching this program after, or if it's your preferred method, you can also use the email at the bottom, live@lbaop.org. Now, you don't have to use those to connect with us, but we'd love if you did. But if you're just watching along with somebody at home, feel free to just share your ideas that way too. All right, scientists. So today what we're going to do is we're going to explore food webs. Now, what does that quite mean? Well, we'll break it all down. And we're going to use this habitat behind me, called the kelp forest, to show how a food web might work. But before we go into any of that, why don't we just get our brains warmed up? Because as scientists, what we're going to do today is we're going to make observations, which just means we're going to use our sense of sight in this case, right? Because we're just going to be watching all these cool pictures and videos. But we want you to make some observations, see what you notice. So I'm just going to go ahead and step just to the side here. Get your brains warmed up, make some observations. What are some things that you notice about this habitat behind me? Now, observations can be anything really. It could be any fish that you spot. It could be what do you notice about the habitat. It could be any behaviors that you see the animals doing. It could also be things like shapes and colors too, right? All of these things can be observations. So take just a few seconds and see what you notice. Now, I already sort of gave away what this habitat is called. This is the kelp forest. Now, if you've learned about different habitats before, habitats are just the homes for the animals, right? Now, there are many different types of habitats on land too. Maybe you've learned about the rainforest or the desert or the Arctic, right? Different animals call these different places home. And in the ocean too, we also have very different habitats. So if you just go down beneath the waves, it's not all going to look the same. Right here, this kelp forest is found in different parts of the world, including here where we are in Southern California. So kelp forest, you can see that forest is in the name. Can you tell why? It sort of looks like a forest that's underwater. But instead of having trees like a rainforest on land, we have the kelp. That's the other part of the kelp forest name. So kelp is seaweed like you see back here. Now, even though kelp isn't a plant, it actually does a lot of stuff that's very similar to a plant. Now, have you heard about how plants on land make energy? If you haven't learned before, plants are going to use the sun. They use the sun, the light, and the water, and they're going to use those to do something called photosynthesis. And what it does is it makes energy, it helps the plant grow, and then when your plants grow, you get, or plants, or in this case kelp, you start to build the homes for everything, right? So as you can see here, there's lots of kelp flowing in the ocean, but you'll see that they're shooting straight up towards the sun because they're going to need that sun for energy. Now, energy is going to be a key word today because, like I said, our focus is going to be on food webs. So why don't we define what that means? So let's go over here to my document camera. We're going to actually be doing a little bit of drawing today too. If you would like to draw along with me, feel free. You don't have to. But our drawing is going to be how we're going to keep track of everyone. So, a food web. First part, food. Well, you probably know what that means, right? It's what things eat. What do we eat, right? Our food. And so we're going to be looking at in these animals in the kelp forest, what types of things they eat. So we have food, and then the word web. Now, maybe you've seen like something like a spider web, right? Web. Really, really complicated shapes, right? All these different pieces. And that's what we're going to sort of explore is how these different animals connect by the things that they eat, right? Now, when we're thinking of a food web, it's not only just that we're trying to figure out who eats who, we're also trying to figure out this part, how energy moves through a ecosystem or habitat in this case, right? So our ecosystem today is going to be the kelp forest, how energy moves. Now, the link between the food and the energy is, well, think about why we have to eat, right? We need to eat, right? If you're like me, you like to eat all the time. And when we do, that food is going to be used to actually help us make energy so we can do all the things that we need to do. So when we start mapping these different animals, we're really looking at how energy is also moving through the system. All right, so now that we know what a food web is, we're going to begin building. So like I said, we're going to use the kelp forest as our example today, and we're going to start with that thing we just talked about, that kelp. So I'm going to go ahead and start drawing my kelp forest. Now kelp needs a spot to attach to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw some rocks along the side. If you notice back in the webcam, and maybe we can flip back really quick, maybe we can see that another important piece to this system is not just the kelp, because the kelp is going to need those rocks. So why don't we go back really quick and take a look here. You'll see that there's huge rocks down here in the front and actually all along the back. And that's because since kelp is not actually a plant, they don't have roots that dig into soil like plants on land. Instead, they have a structure called a holdfast, which kind of look like roots, but what they really do is they stick themselves to the rocks. So we need to add those first before we can give a place for our kelp. So let's go ahead and go back. Now we have our rocks in place, and let's draw some kelp. So if you would like to draw some kelp with me, you see kelp in the pictures. It's sort of like a green or a brown color. I'm going to use brown for ours today. Now, a holdfast kind of looks like I said, it almost looks like roots. So I just draw that as a couple of lines. And then they go way up towards the top. And then they actually have these little, and I can show you, they have these little sort of air pockets. So I'll bring over some fake kelp here, but at least it'll show you what we mean. So they'll have all these little tiny air bladders. Now, if you live where we do in Southern California and you go to the beach, you might have seen some of this stuff washed up on the beach, and it's kind of fun to pop. But these little air bladders are what help the kelp float up. So in my drawing, I'm going to draw some of those so my kelp can be floating towards the top. And then we're going to draw the blades. Blades are sort of like the leaves of the kelp. So let's draw one on that side, and I'll draw one on this side too. Some kelp. Now, kelp is really important because it's going to be one of the starting points for our food web that we're going to build today. Now, do you remember what I said the kelp uses in order to make energy? Can you remember? Think about plants on land too. They're going to need a very special something in order to start making their energy. And it's way up there in this video, but it's shining through. It's the sun. The sun is going to be the start of most food webs on planet Earth, and so we need a sun. All right, let's add a sun into our drawing here to keep track. All right, we have our sun. I'll put it way up in the corner here above my water. Let me draw that a little bit better. I give my sun a weird shape. We'll give it another try, just like that. There's our sun shining down. Now, when we're drawing food webs, we use arrows. Arrows will tell us who is eating who, but remember, it's also showing where is the energy going, right? So in the case of the sun, right, and you have probably felt the sun's energy if you go out on a sunny day, right? If the sun is shining down on you, right, it feels really, really hot, that heat. Well, that's energy coming from the sun. And so this case, in our case here, the kelp is going to use that energy for itself to grow, right? So in order to make that connection for how the energy gets here, we just draw a little arrow. We draw it coming from the sun, and we draw it going to the kelp. And that is saying energy from the sun is going to the kelp. Now, of course, the kelp isn't eating the sun, right? So that's why it's more important to say that's where the energy is going, from the sun to the kelp. Now, kelp is huge. You might have not seen in that video because we couldn't even see the full thing, but kelp can grow 100+ feet tall. They're huge, right? Now, kelp is really important because it's going to make a home for a lot of different animals, right? And some that we're going to explore today. But even though kelp is giant and huge and uses the sun, there are actually tons of tiny, tiny little things that also use the sun. They look like this. Now, what are we looking at here? I'm just seeing a bunch of weird shapes and circles and things. Maybe even some squares over here, right? What could all these be? Well, what you're looking at here are a type of plankton. Have you ever heard of plankton before? If you've seen a certain show, you may have heard of a character named Plankton too. But plankton are what we call drifters, meaning they float around in the ocean. So they're critters that are not strong enough to really swim on their own. They depend on the ocean to move them around. Now, most plankton is small. In fact, in this picture, we're actually looking through a microscope. Because if you were to just see these out in the ocean, well, you wouldn't see them. They're so tiny that we can't even just see them with our eyes. We have to put it under a microscope in order to see what they look like. But these things are really, really important. These are a special type of plankton called phytoplankton. Why don't we write that out together? So I'm going to bring up another board here, switch out my drawing really quick, so we can write out what those are. So phytoplankton, it's a big word, I know, but we'll break it down. Phytoplankton. So the plankton part is sort of what we talked about. It means it's a drifter. It means it floats around. They're not strong swimmers, and they're usually small. I say usually because there are actually some weird plankton that are pretty big, like sea jellies, for example. Sea jellies, while they can be pretty big sometimes, pretty huge, jellies are actually plankton too because they're not strong enough to swim in the currents. They are also going to get pushed around with the waves, right? But let's go back to our phytoplankton example, right? So we know they're plankton because they drift, but if we break down the other part, I'll use a different color for this. If we break down the phyto part, think of that like plant. Now, I'm going to use plant to break it down. The real thing you should think of is sort of light. They're going to use light. Because these tiny critters that we saw, while they're not exactly plants, they also kind of behave like little plants. So even though they're teeny, teeny, tiny, they're going to use the sun to make their energy like plants do too, right? So that's where phytoplankton comes from. And even though we can't really see them, even though they're teeny, teeny, tiny, these things are so important because without them, we don't have a lot of the other animals in our food web, right? So why don't we add that onto our drawing really quick, our phytoplankton. And if you want to, this is going to be the easiest thing to draw that you've ever done and the easiest thing for me because I'm just going to show it as some little green dots. Just like that, right? But these phytoplankton, these tiny things, get eaten by slightly bigger, but still tiny things, other kinds of plankton. Why don't we see if we can look at some other types of plankton? Now, we looked at some plant plankton. These are tiny animal plankton, right? So there are actually in the ocean tons of different kinds of animals that are really, really teeny tiny. But these little teeny tiny animals eat those teeny tiny plants. But they're going to be an important step to connecting to bigger animals, which we're going to look at next. So why don't we draw in some of our teeny tiny animal plankton. I'll just draw some little brown dots. Those are my tiny animal plankton. And just like before, right, we can make these connections. We know that the phytoplankton are going to use energy from the sun. And now we know that those little animal plankton are going to eat these phytoplankton, right? Okay, sweet. Let's look at some bigger animals now too that live in the kelp forest. I want to look at an animal that's going to make our next connection to the kelp. It's a little spiky creature. Let's see if you know what it is. This one right here. Do you recognize this animal? Make some observations here, and you can share them with us, or if you're watching with someone, share with them. Do you know what this animal is? Or what are some things you notice about it? What's special about this animal? Well, This animal is called a sea urchin. What do you notice about the sea urchin? How about this? Imagine if you were to touch the sea urchin. What do you think it would feel like? My guess would be pretty spiky. And that's true, right? Because as you can see, there are these spines that are all around the sea urchin. Now, why do you think a sea urchin would have all these spines around its body? How could that help a sea urchin in the kelp forest? Hmm, any ideas? Well, imagine you're a fish swimming around in the kelp forest. You're looking for something to eat. If you see something that is full of spikes, is that probably going to be your first choice of food? Probably not, right? That might hurt your mouth as you bite through it. So, sea urchins have these spines as a way to protect themselves, to try and keep themselves safe from predators. Now, what else do you notice in this picture? Do you see anything else? Look right here. This is some of that kelp that we were looking at earlier. So this urchin in the picture is actually enjoying a little snack because urchins love to eat kelp, right? So let's add that on to our food web. Now, sea urchins come in a whole bunch of different colors. I'll do a purple one since we saw a purple one in that picture. So in order to draw a little sea urchin, what I do is do like a half circle. Sort of like that. And then just draw some spikes coming out. And you have a sea urchin. And then I'll draw one on this side too. Now, remember, for our food web, we're thinking about who eats who and where the energy is going. So, do you remember who, or I guess, what does our sea urchin love to eat? We just saw it in that picture. They're going to eat that kelp. So if we want to draw that the energy from the kelp is going to the sea urchin, because that's what they like to eat, we'll take an arrow from the kelp and point it to the sea urchin. And we can do both sides too. Maybe this sea urchin wants to eat some kelp too, over here on this side. All right, so now we're starting to see a food web come together, right? So an urchin likes to eat the kelp. Kelp gets its energy from the sun. The sun is also fueling our little phytoplankton who are getting eaten by some tiny animal plankton too. Let's keep going. Let's see what other animals we can explore. Now, we're going to go to a very adorable animal. Maybe you recognize this one, but it's one of my favorites. Do you recognize this animal here? This is the sea otter. Now, sea otters are adorable, of course, right? They're so cute. They're so fun to watch, but they're really important animals too. Now, this one is actually enjoying some snacks here. Take a look and see how they eat. Right? What do you notice about what they're doing? Take a look. You can see that some food is being handed to them, and that's because these otters are the ones living here at the aquarium. But you can see that they use their little paws to float on, they're floating on their back. They use their paws to bring their food up to their mouth. And you can see, if you look closely, they have some pretty strong, big teeth that they use to eat their food. Now, sea otters, like I said, are very adorable, but they're very important animals in the kelp forest. Why don't we add one to our drawing, and we'll talk about why they're so important. All right, my friends. Now, I'm going to try and draw a otter in my kelp forest, but please, please know that I am not the best drawer of the best artist when it comes to sea otters, but I'm going to try my best, and that's what matters. So I'm going to draw my otter floating at the top, because like we just saw in that video, they like to hang out towards the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my otter a little face here. We're going to do some little ears there. We're going to draw its little paws, and it needs some flippers to swim. Now that goofy thing, my friends, is a sea otter for my drawing. All right. Now, what do we think a sea otter likes to eat? Why don't we see if we can take a look at some other examples of some other pictures of the sea otter, or maybe them eating some other things too, and see if we can figure it out. Now, like I said, sea otters have some pretty strong teeth on the front. I wonder what they're going to use those for. Now, sea otters are also really smart. They're one of the few animals that use tools. So they can actually use like rocks or shells to break their food open. But what would they need to break open? Do you think they might eat fish? I mean, they live in the kelp forest, right? We saw lots of fish earlier, so maybe they eat fish. Well, Not really. Fish are usually not a main thing that sea otters are going to eat, mostly because fish are a little too fast for them to catch. So instead, what sea otters are going to do is they're going to dive down to the bottom of a kelp forest and they're going to look for things that live in hard shells, right? That might be something like clams or crabs or even that little spiky creature we looked at earlier, the sea urchin. Take a look at this adorable face and those teeth sticking out right there. So, using tools and those strong teeth means that they can break through animals with hard shells, right? And one of them, like I said, is that sea urchin. So, let's go ahead and add that into our food web. Make those connections, right? Now, sea urchin's spines do a great job at keeping away a lot of predators, but there are still some that have figured out how to break through all those spines, and one of them is the sea otter. So, in order to show that the energy from the urchin goes to the otter, we're going to draw an arrow from our urchin up to our otter, right? And there, we now have another connection in our food web. Now, another piece of food that I mentioned that they love to eat are things like clams. So, clams are things that live in hard shells too. I'm not sure if maybe we can find a picture. I'm kind of making Tiffany do quite a bit today. But we'll see if we can find some pictures. I'll also have some shells I can show you too. Let me see if I can find some of those. But clams are pretty common in many different parts of the ocean. And let me see if I can find some shells to show you. Here's one. So here's a clam shell, right? Now clams will actually have two shells. This is only one of them. But clams live in two shells like this, and they can open and close. Now, when they open, it's because they're opening to try and feed. Now, clams, as you can see, might have some different shapes, but usually they're sort of round like this. Why don't we add a little clam into our drawing down here? So I'm going to take let's do a different color. I'll do this sort of light color. Sometimes clams can have these light colors too. So clams will live usually down at the bottom. So I'm going to draw a clam here. And the way I'm going to draw a clam is literally just by drawing a sort of circle shell, because that's really what they sort of look like. So there's our clam. Now, clams, like I mentioned, will open their shell when it's time to eat. But what do you think a clam is going to eat by opening its shell? Because they're not really going to move very much. They're definitely not going to be hunting anything. So that's where these come to play. These plankton that we talked about earlier, remember, they're just floating through the water. And there's tons of them. Well, at least in the kelp forest, there's going to be lots of plankton, right? And so that is actually going to be a main source of food for a clam. So a clam doesn't need to really move. Instead, it just opens up, and as the water moves around all the plankton, they will filter feed. Filter feed means as water passes through, they're going to filter out or catch all of the little plankton. So that's where we next here. Animal plankton can be caught, things like the clams. And then, like I said, they like to get eaten by the otters too. So now we're going to make another arrow from clams all the way back up to the otters. All right, now you can see there is a lot going on in our food web, right? Take a look at this adorable otter eating some food. We had to look once again. But if we go back to our food web, you'll see there is a lot going on, right? And that's where the web part of the definition, the web, comes into play, because as you can see, it can get pretty complicated once you start figuring out who is eating who in this place. Now, I mentioned earlier that sea otters are really important, and part of the reason is because of one of those things that they eat, right? They might eat some clams, crabs too, but their ability to eat these sea urchins is really important. And that's because, think back to the urchins. We saw all those spines, right? And I told you that there are not many animals that have figured out how to eat these things because their spines are so strong, right? Now, otters, unfortunately, were hunted in the past, mainly for their fur. And because of that, we saw otters start to disappear in many parts of the world, including here in Southern California. Now, look at our food web, right? If we were to hide our were to hide our sea otter, right? Look at what connections start to get lost, right? Maybe you have less things eating clams, and that might be okay because there's other things that will eat the clams too. But this urchin part is really important because what is the urchin eating? They're eating that kelp, right? So if you take away the predators that like to eat the urchin, well, then sometimes there can be too many urchins because they're not having a lot of predators. And if there's too many urchins, they're going to eat too much kelp. Now, why do we care about that? Well, take a look here. What do you notice, right? Do you see a kelp forest behind me anymore? Take a close look. Let's see. What is different about this versus the healthy kelp forest that we saw a little bit earlier? Well, for one, I don't really see any kelp. Do you? No, right? The forest part is gone. And that's because these urchins have eaten too much of that kelp. It's all gone away, right? But think even further than that. Even though there's no kelp, is there anything else that's missing? Do you see any fish? Or even any other different types of animals? Not really, right? I think there's like one little fish that passes by in the distance. But does this look like the healthy kelp forest where there was lots of different animals calling it home? No, right? This is what we call an urchin barren. That's when there's too many urchins that have eaten all the kelp. And when you lose the kelp, well, now you've lost the home for everything else, right? And so that's why sea otters are so important. They help to keep the balance in the kelp forest to make sure that this doesn't happen, so that the kelp forest can stick around for all the other animals that call it home, right? So let's go to our food web, right? We're now seeing so many different connections in the kelp forest, but like I said, sea otters have actually disappeared because they were hunted from many different parts, including here in Southern California. But if you were to come visit here in Southern California and go diving in our ocean, you will actually still find some kelp. Now, how could that be? If otters have disappeared, I thought that urchins always are going to eat all that kelp and make it go away. Well, even though there are not many other predators of urchins, there are still some really important ones. So today, I'm going to introduce you to a really cool sea star called the sunflower star. I'm going to have my friend Tiffany see if she can show us a picture of this really amazing animal, and we'll talk about how these animals are important too. Let's see if we can take a look. Now, a sunflower star is a type of sea star. Maybe you've seen some sea stars before, right? But does this look any different from a sea star that you might be used to? What's different? Let me see if my friend Tiffany can throw us up a picture of a different type of sea star. And let's see if we can compare the two. Let's see. What about something like this? Any differences that you can spot? Well, if we're looking at sea stars, normally they're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those arms. Let's go back to the side. There's still 5. No, there's more, right? In fact, sunflower stars can have over 20 arms. Now, sunflower stars are super cool. On this, we're actually looking at the underside too. And all of these little lines underneath are something called tube feet. They're almost like little suction cups, right? But sunflower stars are also the biggest sea star in the ocean. They get pretty massive. Now, sunflower stars are going to use those suction cups, those sticky feet, to slide around the bottom of the kelp forest and look for the different types of prey. Now, sunflower stars also have a favorite type that is very similar to the otters. Those urchins, right? These guys here. So sunflower stars, right, they also can sort of serve that role of eating urchins and being an important part of a balanced kelp forest ecosystem. Now, sunflower stars have also faced some trouble too. Unfortunately, stars have been hit by a mysterious disease that has killed many of these sea stars. But something cool that's going on here at the Aquarium of the Pacific is we are working to learn how to raise sunflower stars so that we can grow them here to learn more about them, learn more about that mysterious disease, and one day we'll be able to hopefully put these back out into the oceans to help make sure that we keep our kelp forest healthy. So before we go, let's draw on our sunflower star real quick, and then we will wrap up. So for us, sunflower stars come in different colors, right? It could be like an orange or a red, so you can choose which one you like. They're also sort of purple sometimes too. I'm going to draw orange over here on the side, and to draw them, you just need a circle, and basically think of like you're drawing a flower. They have all of those arms that go all the way around, right? And now you have drawn a sunflower star. And to finish us off, we know that they also love to eat those sea urchins, right? So these predators, the sea otters, the sunflower stars, and some others we didn't get to today, are all important predators that make sure that the ecosystem stays in balance. Because as we now know, they can change completely. And the food web tool that we use today of showing these different connections is how scientists can help keep track of these relationships between animals. And so what we did is we showcased some of these different relationships in the kelp forest. All right, explorers, thank you so much for joining. I had a great time. I hope you did as well. We'll throw that number and email up one more time so that if you have any lingering questions, be sure to either text them in using this number here or use the email down below, and we'll be sure to get back to you. So thank you so much once again. I had a wonderful time. I encourage you all to keep on exploring, because while we covered a lot today, there's always still more to discover. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.